Hello, and welcome to the final webinar of the series on the topic Building the Proposed Template for Roadway Designer. The first 6 parts of this series covered the basics of what you need to get started building a template, style constraints, null points, display rules, end conditions, the bundled driveway components, some unique situations, parametric constraints, and labels. This webinar will focus on intersection setup. My name is Kathy Kassar with MDOT Engineering Support Services. The next webinar series will get into some of the specifics on Roadway Designer, such as setting up a corridor, superelevation, target aliasing, point controls, creating surfaces, and of course intersections. As a recap from Part 1, before attempting to build a proposed template, it is necessary to have the proposed plan view drawn in a GeoPack plan file. Again, it is recommended that that be a separate file from the proposed plan file that will be attached to the project plan sheets. It is also necessary to know how to import the DDB, TIN, geometry, and plan view graphics into Corridor Modeler. This webinar series focused primarily on the template itself and not the importing process. Briefly, the following are recommended in order to work with Corridor Modeler: a GeoPack project PRJ file created and opened, a working alignment definition defined and in use, and lastly, a Corridor Modeler RDP or batch load file created and loaded. The following 4 items were discussed in the previous webinars of this series. These 4 tools and concepts are critical elements to building a good template. First of all, style constraints. Style constraints allow a point on a template to file plan view graphics imported with a defined symbology or drafting style, meaning that level, color, line style, and weight of a given element. Style constraints have a limited seek distance and operate best when given a defined seek direction, negative to the left, positive to the right. It is important to understand that style constraints are the lowest form of exterior control on a template. Null points. Null points once again are more or less testing points. If used correctly, they can help Roadway Designer decide what template options are needed based upon all the information that has been imported into Corridor Modeler. Each null point represents an option for the template to test for. It is important to note that only one null point is needed for each option you may be seeking or testing for with a style constraint or point controls. Display rules. Once again, display rules are on-off switches in the template that the Roadway Designer will use based upon all the information you have defined. Since they are switches, display rules provide a method to swap out sections and pieces of any template to accommodate various roadway conditions. You can pair up display rules or nest them so that they work together. There are a number of different types of display rules that can be set. This webinar series has focused solely on the horizontal offset display rule. Lastly, end conditions. End conditions are the outside components that tie to the active surface, most commonly the existing ground. These components have some additional intelligence embedded into them that allows the template to make various choices as to how to tie into that active surface based upon defined criteria. They must be the farthest outside components on a template. Any component placed after end condition will not display or performed as desired. End conditions can be nested together so that you can have many different end conditions for the software to select between according to a specific order or priority. End conditions should have the component name and feature name override set in order to model correctly, provide a consistent slope stake line, and a connected 3D model, as well as for allowing for easier cross-section labeling. Again, you will need a solid understanding of all these concepts to be able to build a good working template and to be able to fully model in an intersection. So, intersection setup. Some important things to note about preparing a template to model intersections are: you will need both a horizontal and a vertical alignment for any intersection model, for the side road as well as the main line. These alignments will need to be imported into Corridor Modeler. Eventually, you will create horizontal and vertical alignments for the radii of the intersection, most commonly the edges of pavement, which will also need to be imported into Corridor Modeler. However, you can import plan view graphics for simple intersections if you do not wish to control each radius independently, meaning that you just want to hold the constant slopes across the entering roadway, but that would be a very rare case. You will need to import plan view graphics for the intersection with different symbology than the mainline edges of pavement or other similar plan view elements. This is important so that the style constraints already in use for the mainline template do not see the intersection elements. Some items will need to be controlled with different triggers. You will use all the tools in the toolbox, so to speak, to correctly model an intersection. Style constraints will be needed for the template to follow the edges of pavement. display rules and null points will be needed to trigger the intersection components. And once we complete the intersection in Roadway Designer, point controls and corridor points will also be needed. Keep in mind, intersection setup and modeling has a slightly different setup than GORS, or tapered parallel entrance and exit ramps, in Roadway Designer, but the template setup is very similar. The next webinar series will focus on the various aspects of using Roadway Designer, including how to complete the intersection modeling as well as GOR modeling. I'm going to go ahead and pop out to MicroStation now, and we'll take a look at some of the elements that we've been talking about. Alright, so this is the project, of course, that we've been working on, and this is the intersections that we're going to be focused on and creating our templates for. Again, as I mentioned, that you do need alignments. Take a quick look at Corridor Modeler under the Geometry tab. We did import already the alignment for the south side of Maple, and then this alignment here for the north side of Maple. Those alignments have already been imported, as well as their profiles. As far as plan view graphics, I went ahead and imported already this line. This is a style constraint we're going to be using for this line here, this no plot line and this line. And these lines essentially are going to be used to help Corridor Modeler understand that there is an intersection that needs to take place. What I've also done here is using the DP station offset for these alignments. And what I did is pick the whole station, and I picked 10 plus 25 in this case, so that for this location, in order to get a whole station, because what's going to happen when you do this in Corridor Modeler, when you actually want to model this intersection, you will model this as a corridor as well as the main line as a corridor. Each one of these intersections is its own corridor, and you want to be able to stop it at a whole station so that it's easy to locate. So what I found was a whole station that fell within about the midpoint of each of the radii on both sides, and that's just a generic it's pretty much a random location in a sense, but I do want to hit that somewhere in the middle, because as I said, when you model with Roadway Designer, it's going to want to look perpendicular. So this is going to come perpendicular, and there comes a point where I'm going to be backing up on top of myself. So obviously you'll see when I hit that radius twice, that's not going to work. So I have to stop it prior to that tangent point, that perpendicular from the alignment and tangent to the radius of the intersection. So I pick a point that is before that occurs, and I want to make sure I hit it in the radius if at all possible, and not have to deal with going back into a tangent. But when you do get into a very skewed section, sometimes you have to do something with the tangent also, because one radius will end before the other one. It gets even started depending on the skew angle. But anyway, what was imported was these lines to indicate where an intersection is taking place. Okay, we're only going to handle the actual template setup, not the actual full Corridor Modeler setup and Roadway Designer setup at this point. But that's all that that's the only thing I imported. I imported these front lines. I drew these lines in for the back area, but I did not, as of yet, import them. There's actually not even something that needs to be imported. These are lines that I will use down the line for Roadway Designer. So these are just my locations, and to help me understand where I'm going to end my models for the intersections themselves, or for the side roads, I should say. Okay, so this is our project template, and looking at the project template, I just want to show you here what I've done here is I've brought in some null points that allow the intersection to pop out here, and these are just two null points I've added to do the find the intersection. We'll move these out so you can see there's not much really there. That's just a pavement section on a slope that's running a 2% slope at a particular distance. These, when we get done with the actual model, will follow the edge of pavement and will also tie into the surface of the side road. So I just have something in there right now so that I can kind of keep track of it, but this will have more work once we get the finalized intersection ready. I just want to show you right now that pavement's coming in. And of course there is a section, there's a section here if we look at the curb, that you'll see that the curb lines need to continue right around the corners. I do have to have that curb, but I don't need the curb when I'm in this intersection proper. So in order to show that here in the template, I didn't want to have to create another null point for curb because I already have one that will turn the curb on. So what we did here is just come out and tie into that same display rule that was already set up to look for curb. Now this one says shoulder curb, but still it's the same thing. So what I did was I set up the display rules set up so that if I use this, it would also pull out the curb that I need for the shoulder section. I did the same on the other side. See, so that will pop the curb out. This null point, I've only got one null point that's talking about curb in here. So I didn't have to make another one for the intersection itself. I can use that inside of Roadway Designer. So that's how this has been set up. So if I take a look at the display rules, we'll actually move it out we'll edit that point and move it out for a minute so I can show you. Alright, so to show you the display rules, I'll put this back in for a minute here and I'll put it in the middle. And if I show you this curb line, you'll see that there's quite a number of display rules that have been set on this. And the reason is that obviously we have many different conditions with different driveways, but the order of these actually has an important part, that plays an important part, I should say, in getting the intersections and all these things to work properly. You'll notice I have a not, and then an and not, and then an and not, and this is the intersection display rule, and then an and not, and then an or. What you can't do is start to mix these up. You have to have all of your and nots or all of your negatives combined together, all of your ands or your positives, it's your true conditions combined together, and then the ors. Because if you don't, if you put in an and not and then an and then an and not and then an and you mix them up, what happens is they tend not to work correctly. So what I found, and I found that kind of by trial and error, is that you have to keep your like types as in I'm looking for the false condition, the false condition, the false condition, the false condition, and then something different. And that's how you have to set these up in order to get them to work. So that order actually is important. So pay attention to that. Alright, so we'll move this one back in. And we will then go ahead and create our template. Okay, so I'm going to switch down to the project. This was the template from the last webinar, so we'll copy it and paste it, and then I'll rename it as Webinar 7 so we can maintain these into the default template library. Alright, so the first thing we'll do, of course, is turn on my dynamic settings. I'll set my steps up to 0.1 and 0.1. I'll set my point style to DNC point, because I don't want that to be included in my surface. Click Apply Affixes, and then I will give myself a name here, so find intersection, and then I will right click, add a null point, and I'll put one here on the left and another one on null point on the right. Of course, they get their affixes, they get their underbar R and L because of the apply affixes checkbox. I'll edit that point. Again, I like them on a track, so I'll give it a vertical location and lock it in. I'll do the same here on the right side, and I'll lock in a nice vertical location. Alright, so those are now up there. They're on their track. Of course, they don't do anything. We haven't assigned any display rules to them at this point. Okay, so I've got my two null points. I also need to go ahead and set my style constraints that these are searching for. And of course, I set that symbology as DNC component. This is going to seek to the left. I will go 50 feet out, and then I will set the right, of course, for the same style constraint for DNC component, and we'll seek that to the right, positive 50 feet. So now my components, my null points are set to seek my Plan B graphics. And I will go ahead and set up the display rule. So I'll hit edit, and we can just make them here. So I'll hit add, and we will say left find intersection, or the left intersection is found. So I'm looking for that true condition. Horizontal, it will be found if my display rule to my edge of pavement is less than or equal to 0. Okay, so if it is to the left or equal to my edge of pavement. Alright, that's important because I put my line work on the edge of pavement. Okay, so we'll say OK. Alright, so I'll make the right one while I'm here, and I'll call it right find intersection, meaning that the right intersection is found. Alright, and again that will be a horizontal, and that will be between my right find intersection point, null point, and my edge of pavement, and that will be true so long as I am greater than or equal to 0. So you'll notice here that these two find intersections, right find intersection, left find intersection, are both false, of course, at this time, as they should be. Alright. And then we can go ahead, now we'll add those onto my curb lines. So again, we have an and situation here. We have an and not, so I can add another and not left find intersection. And it should remain because it's still in the false condition. And on this side, we'll edit this, right shoulder off, and we'll do another and not, and we'll do the right find intersection. Now if you notice, this is a lot shorter argument than what I had in the base template, and that's because I didn't do all of the driveway conditions in our templates here in this webinar series of templates that I did in the project. So we don't have quite all of the same arguments. Okay, so at this point, if I bring this out, and we'll bring them both out for right now, I'll go ahead and have this case. So now you see that everything has dropped off. Now, of course, this is one school of thought on intersections. There are a couple of different ways to go about it. This is one way where I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to bring in some components I've already created. Again, for the sake of time, I created a intersection or some components already that we can be used for the intersection, which I'll go ahead and drag in and mirror. Now this is one school of thought to actually bring in brand new components. The other one is to leave them embedded in, similar to what I did where I had the bike path hidden, as we saw in the first few webinars. You could do the same thing with your intersection and just leave your an extra point in here that would be for the intersection. That's another school of thought. I'm showing you this one, but there are several different ways to go about it. Alright, so the next thing we'll do here is I'll go ahead and set up my display rule, and this of course is the left find intersection, right? And then of course my curb, which is already set up in my mini template, has having the parent of being this widening section or the intersection flare, whichever you want to call it. But it also needs to have a display rule set up that says that has the curb. So this one has to have the left shoulder curb, so it's a not and select rule, right? So that we can make the curb, because obviously right now the shoulder curb is currently off. So if I bring this out, then the shoulder curb becomes true and we get the curb scenario, right? So we can move that back in, right about in there, and then we'll do the other side. So the other side, of course, we need to set this intersection here. We need to set the display rule, and in this case my right shoulder, or my right intersection I should say, comes on. And then my curb section, we need to set this to have the, again, the not, and we'll add the right shoulder curve. Apply and off. Okay, so here we go. So again, I don't have anything until I move out my curb line. And here is my intersection coming back and forth. Alright, it's always good to double check and make sure that you don't have anything competing. So you see in this case, when I bring the shoulder out, if the intersection is out also, we have multiple components, which we don't want that to happen. So on the shoulder, we're going to go and say we're going to edit this, and of course we'll add the and not and the intersection. And the reason is I want the intersection to show up if I trigger it. And even if there happens to be some shoulder line there, I would prefer to use the intersection, not the shoulder, to rule, because I want to be able to control that vertical alignment of this a little bit, the elevation, and I want to control that differently than I would the shoulder. So I want this to most likely it's going to be following a profile that I will have as I manipulate the grade going around the corner to make sure the drainage of the intersection works properly. So I only want to have to set this this one point. If I do it with the shoulder, then it's a little bit convoluted of when the shoulder's already got super elevation or other things attached to it. I may not want to be editing that same point. So that's why I'll put that on the shoulder, and that way that's what gets turned off, is the shoulder, and the intersection then rules if it comes into play. Okay, so we'll come over to the left side, and I'll move out my intersection and then move out my shoulder. And of course I have the duplicates, so I'll edit the shoulder. I'll do an and not and add my left intersection. Apply and close. And of course now my shoulder section disappears, which is what I want. So as I move this out, I move that shoulder back in and return my template. Alright, so one thing to note, of course, obviously in the importing I did not import the curb. I'm going to go out to that for a minute. Remember, I said I didn't import anything on the curb, and the reason is I don't want to have my mainline template kind of get confused and have this in, and I also won't be able to stop it because my intersection corridor is going to model until this station right here, and I don't want it to try and continue to add curb once I reach this point. So the intention is not to import this curb line to do my triggering of curb. Now remember, I said this is the curb. This transition right now, of course, uses a style constraint. If I edit that point, it's looking for a style constraint. However, when I get into Roadway Designer, I can actually control this with a point control. So in my point control setups in Roadway Designer, which we'll take a look at when we get to that point, what will happen is that I will call this point and move it with a point control within the limits of Roadway Designer. Also too, in my mini template, I did set up my override names so that these names are already been set, again with both my curb and my points and my end of my end condition points have already been set up, again with the same symbology and override name, so that regardless, it should be able to create a model that has all of those points connected. So just as the bike path is connected, and there is still the bike path on this piece, and then of course my override names for my curb have been set, as well as the override names of my bits of sub-base material. So you'll notice as I bring the intersection out again, and I bring out this shoulder point, you'll notice that that override name has been set on those, so that we can make sure that we're getting a nice connected model. I'll bring that back in and return our template to the base condition. Just to kind of give you a quick preview, again, this is Roadway Designer's window, just to show you what we're talking about. Of course, here's the template. You'll see that I'm modeling my intersection at a frequency of 1 foot, and so in the locations of the intersection, just to show you here, from this point of the intersection to this point of the intersection, I model it at 1 foot. This is pretty common. Right now I just have the template library, the template dropped in, I should say, and you can see that I haven't finished the setup completely of the intersection, but you'll see that when I get into those the area of the intersection, and that's what this is. And a good way to see if you're modeling correctly is to turn on the corridor display references really quick, and you'll see that I'm looking for my intersections, and those are highlighted. So what happens is if I put them into the display references, it will tell me that it is located the intersection in this location, and so that helps you to kind of make sure that things are modeling correctly. So we'll see here that I'm finding my intersection on the right. As well. So that makes it easy to kind of keep track and make sure that you're locating things as you should be. So these lines, vertical lines, tell me when they have located certain aspects that I have told under my display references. So this is just a quick look at Corridor Modeler and how the intersection appears once you start to look it in there. And again, I haven't modeled this completely, but I can see that my template is working correctly. When I get within the intersection, I'm seeing the curb, and again, that was done with a point control. I'll bring up that point controls menu very briefly here. And down here, we have my intersection curb where I'm actually forcing the curb to come out, and you'll see that point highlight. That tells me that I've moved it out. And I did that for the sections, again, where I had curb. So I'll show you. So that point control was set from here to this point there, and of course then I want to drop it off through the intersection because there's no curb, and then I'll pick it up again from there to there so that I can have the curb line show up and not have it where the intersection proper is. Of course, we'll get into all the specifics of how you set that up and actually setting up the intersection so that it fully models in the Roadway Designer webinars. Kind of give you a quick peek at where we're going with this, and that it does in fact work in Roadway Designer using a few point controls to set the intersection itself up. We'll be able to set it up so that we get the model. So that was a quick look at the template setup for intersections. For some hands-on training for MDOT staff and those with access to Bentley Learn, try the course Advanced Roadway Designer for GeoPack, which will cover many of the topics covered in this webinar. For MDOT staff, there is also some supplemental training material available in ProjectWise. Please email the MDOT Power GeoPack support email address if you need help locating it. This concludes the final webinar, Part 7 of the proposed template series. Thank you.